This is lecture 2 from chapter 1. This lecture is going to be talking about the nature and process of science. The following are the main topics from this lecture. We'll talk about the scientific method, go through the steps of the scientific method. We'll talk about experiments and experimental design, come back to the scientific method and talk about some real-world applications, discuss the differences between hypotheses, theories, and paradigms, and end with a discussion of applied science, or the applications of science. All right, here's the scientific method. You've probably seen it before. It's made up of a series of 5 or 6 steps, depending on the main idea, but both depending on the layout, but both are pretty similar. Scientific method starts with the concept of an observation. You notice something. That observation leads to a question. How does it work? Why is it doing that? What caused this to happen? Those questions lead to tentative explanations called hypotheses. Okay? Educated guesses. I think this is what's going on to cause that event. The hypothesis then is used to generate a prediction or group of predictions that can be tested, right, experimentally. The tests then lead to data, which we call our results, and those results either reject our original hypothesis or fail to reject our original hypothesis. Note that results never confirm a hypothesis, but only lend support to it by failing to reject it. We'll work on going through this process in class. For right now, I'll just take a look at it, and I'll give you some examples as we go on here. When we're setting up an experiment, there's a number of things we need to be aware of. First of all, experiments involve variables. Okay? When variables are conditions that can be changed or that can change. And scientists manipulate variables. They change variables and they see what happens. We can divide variables into 2 groups: independent variables and dependent variables. Independent variables are the variable that the scientist manipulates or changes. It's the presumed cause, if you will. Dependent variables are the variable that depends on or may depend on the independent variable. That's the response. So it's the presumed effect. Let's take a look at an example here, and there's some good examples in your text as well. Here's an example hypothesis. There will be a statistically significant difference in graduation rates of at-risk high school seniors who participate in an intensive study program as opposed to at-risk high school seniors who do not participate in the intensive study program. Okay, so there's the hypothesis. You can see the authors there and the year that it was published, or the year that it was published. In this example, what's the independent variable? The variable that the scientist manipulates. In this case, it's going to be the participation in the intensive study program. Okay, whether or not the student participates. The dependent variable then, the one that is measured, the response or the presumed effect, is the graduation rate of the at-risk students. Take a look at the book. There's a good algal growth and fertilizer example in there. See if you can reason through it. When we talk about experiments, we also need to think about the concept of a controlled experiment and how to design a controlled experiment. The idea of a controlled experiment is you want to try to test a single variable, right? Change one thing and see if that's what's causing what's the effects. Okay. We can, in a controlled experiment, we can say there is a control group and a treatment group. So pretend the robin over here is the control group and the robin over here is part of the treatment group. Okay. What we try to do when we design an experiment is to have a situation in which the environments of the robins are exactly the same, except for one small, or not one small, one factor. Okay. So let me give you an example about involving robins. Suppose a scientist observes an abnormality in the growth of robin embryos in a certain area. She knows that the area has been sprayed with a pesticide and suspects the chemical may be causing the abnormality she has observed. To test this hypothesis, the scientist carries out a controlled experiment. She maintains two groups of robin embryos of the same age in the laboratory. Each group is exposed to exactly the same conditions of light, temperature, food supply, etc. Except that the embryos in the experimental group are exposed to a known amount of the pesticide in question. Okay, then the embryos in both groups are examined over an identical period of time for abnormality. If the scientist finds a significantly larger number of abnormalities in the experimental group than in the control group, the results support the idea that the pesticide is the culprit. To be sure there are no errors that have occurred in the procedure, the original researcher should repeat the experiment several times, and ideally one or more other scientists should repeat the experiment on an independent basis. Okay? So when we're talking about a controlled experiment here with the robins and the robin embryos, we're trying to figure out what's causing the abnormalities, okay, in the development of the robins. Is it a pesticide? So we control for everything we can. The treatment group and the control group are identical, except for we expose the treatment group, right, to a small amount of pesticide and see what happens. When we're thinking about experimental design, you can also think about the difference between a manipulative experiment and a natural or correlational experiment. Okay? In a manipulative experiment, as we can see over here, we've got two greenhouses, right? And we're growing wheat, and we're trying to test whether or not temperature, a difference in temperature of 20 degrees versus 25 degrees will cause the changes in wheat that we are wondering whether the temperature is going to cause. Okay, everything else is the same: water, precipitation, sunlight, etc. Okay, so we control for all those, and we just have that one factor. In natural or correlational experiments, right, we have the same sort of situation. We're trying to test whether or not wheat grows at different latitudes or different temperatures, I'm sorry. But instead of setting up in a laboratory or in a greenhouse, we have one up here at 40 degrees north and the second study at 35 degrees north. And we test and see how the wheat grows in those two environments. Now, the difference between those two experiments is one is a controlled experiment. The manipulative experiment, we're trying to control for that one factor. In the natural experiment, we're searching for correlation or statistical association, right? But we're not able to determine direct cause and effect because there could be a number of other factors besides temperature involved. So the pros of a natural experiment are, well, one good thing is it preserves that real world complexity, right? That idea that it could be more than one factor that's at play when looking at differences between wheat harvest. The cons is it's difficult to decipher if that one factor, temperature, is the main one. So if you look at this figure, the scientific process as practiced by the scientific community, you can see that main area here shows what the process as we looked at. Now, there's a lot of other steps. Once you get your results, right, you need to create a paper, a scientific paper, okay? Write it out, document what you did, your materials, your methods, the results, what you think it means. That then goes to a peer review where scientists that have similar backgrounds will go through and make sure that your data makes sense and that you've crossed your T's and dotted your I's. The paper then will be either rejected or accepted for publication. If it's rejected, it can be revised and then go back through that peer review process. If it gets accepted, it is published in a scientific journal, and there will be further comment and research by the scientific community, which will feed back right into this part of the scientific process. When we're talking about science, we in this class we'll often run into these terms: hypothesis, theory, and paradigm. And so I've defined those for you here. A hypothesis, right, is that educated guess. I think this is going on. I'm going to make some predictions based on the hypothesis. I'm going to test it. A theory, while it sounds like it's a tentative explanation, is a very well tested and widely accepted explanation in science. So when we use the word theory, it's not just I have a theory about how that works. It's something that's got a lot of peer review and published data on, and wide agreement in the scientific community. A paradigm then is a dominant view of scientists during a certain time period, right? As new information comes in, right? And sometimes it takes a little while for that new information to get into the community and for everybody to understand and agree with on that, right? So there's an example in the text about plate tectonics and that the continents are moving around. I mean, it's a pretty radical idea. We have a lot of experimental data to confirm that. It's now a new paradigm in the 1960s that was accepted into the science of geology. Now, notice on the bottom here, judging good from bad, however, requires more than science. We also need an understanding of ethics, right? So we have all this information, but how we use it, right, and what we do with it is another idea, right? It's based on the idea of ethics, whether what to do with something and to use it for the most good or not. We can also think about, you may have heard of the term applied science or applications of science. And that kind of goes into two main groups that I want to just introduce now. First of all, it's the applications of scientific research that filter into policy decisions, right? So political decisions and also management practices. So the example here is a management practice, right? We know more about that. We've learned, right, through science that forest ecosystems, as we've settled in areas, we've really suppressed fire in forest ecosystems. That causes all kinds of changes. Some of them we don't want to happen, such as very, very large fires, because you get so much fuel load. We now practice the process of prescribed burning, right? Burning some of the fuel load in a forest, getting some of those nutrients back in the forest, opening up some soil for new plants, and getting rid of some of that fuel load in the forest, hopefully avoiding those really catastrophic fires. Another example of applications of science is technology. And so here's an example of a technology that's applied science, environmental science, right? New ways to power transportation, and we'll talk a little bit later on in class about fuel cell cars, as this example shows. All right, thanks. Next lecture will be on ethics and environmental ethics. So stay tuned for that one. Thank you.